November 1944. Somewhere along the front lines in France, a column of American tanks rumbled toward the battlefield. As they approached, soldiers already stationed there stopped what they were doing and watched. It wasn't the tanks that caught their attention. It was the men inside them. Nearly 700 soldiers, all African American, had arrived at the front. They belonged to the 761st Tank Battalion, the first black armored battalion ever deployed into combat by the United States Army. Many senior officers had already made up their minds about them long before they reached Europe. They claimed the battalion would fail under pressure. They insisted the men would panic in battle. Some even argued they lacked the ability to operate tanks effectively in combat. For more than 2 years, the Army had trained them, equipped them, and then left them waiting. While other units shipped overseas, the 761st remained behind. They became the battalion nobody seemed willing to use. Then one general made a decision that changed everything. He specifically requested them. That general was George S. Patton. And the few minutes he spent speaking to those men before their first battle would leave a lasting mark on their lives and eventually on American military history. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, a story firmly documented in the historical record. The battalion was officially activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. From the very beginning, they faced obstacles unlike those encountered by other tank units. The U.S. Army was still segregated, and many high-ranking officers openly questioned whether black soldiers possessed the intelligence, discipline, or courage required for armored warfare. Tanks were considered highly technical machines. Combat inside them was fast, dangerous, and unforgiving. Many military leaders believed African Americans simply could not handle the responsibility. The 761st was determined to prove them wrong. Stationed primarily at Camp Hood, Texas, the battalion trained relentlessly. Their officers and instructors made one thing clear. If another unit made a mistake, it would be viewed as an individual error. If the 761st made a mistake, many people would use it as evidence against every black soldier in uniform. The pressure was enormous, so they worked harder, they drilled endlessly, they studied every aspect of armored warfare. By the standards of Army evaluations and training reports, they became one of the most capable tank battalions in the country. Yet despite their performance, they remained sidelined. D-Day came. The Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. American units poured into Europe. The 761st stayed in Texas, watching, waiting. Among the soldiers who briefly served within the battalion was a young lieutenant named Jackie Robinson, who would later become famous for breaking Major League Baseball's color barrier. Although Robinson never deployed with the unit, the battalion he once belonged to was preparing to make history of its own. The men adopted a simple but powerful motto, "Come out fighting." By the fall of 1944, events in Europe were moving rapidly. General Patton's Third Army had advanced across France at remarkable speed, but success came at a cost. Tanks were being destroyed, experienced crews were becoming casualties. Patton needed replacement armored units immediately. Patton's personal views on race were complicated and often deeply troubling by modern standards. Yet there was one thing he valued above almost everything else: victory. And he had learned that a fully trained tank battalion was sitting unused in the United States. Whatever others believed about the 761st, Patton wanted combat-ready soldiers, so he requested them. In late October 1944, the battalion finally crossed the Atlantic and entered France. Not long after arriving near the front, the men were ordered to assemble. A convoy approached. Out stepped one of the most recognizable military figures in the world, General George S. Patton. To ensure everyone could see him, Patton climbed onto the hood of a vehicle and addressed the formation. Hundreds of soldiers stood silently in the cold. Many wondered what he would say. Patton's words would stay with them for the rest of their lives. He reminded them that they were making history. They would be the first African-American tank battalion to fight in combat for the United States Army. The eyes of the nation, he said, would be watching. Then he delivered the message that mattered most. Patton told them he had personally requested their battalion because he believed they were good enough to fight. He stated that he wanted only the best soldiers available. And he made it clear that he cared about performance, not skin color. For men who had spent years hearing doubts about their worth, the impact was enormous. Many had never before heard a senior commander speak to them as soldiers first and foremost. One veteran later reflected that Patton treated them like professional fighting men when so many others had not. But words alone were not what mattered. Patton backed them up with action. He sent the 761st into combat. The battalion entered the fight in early November 1944. The predictions of failure quickly collapsed. Instead of breaking under pressure, the 761st distinguished itself on battlefield after battlefield. They fought across France. They endured the brutal winter conditions of the Battle of the Bulge, when Germany launched its final major offensive in the West. They helped push through the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, guarding the German frontier, and they kept going. The battalion remained in action for an astonishing 183 consecutive days of combat operations. The cost was severe. They lost tanks, they lost friends, they suffered heavy casualties. Many of the men had spent years fighting simply for the opportunity to serve, only to risk their lives for a nation that still denied them full equality. Among those soldiers was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. During combat operations, Rivers' tank struck a landmine. The explosion inflicted a devastating leg wound, exposing bone and leaving him in need of immediate medical treatment. Doctors and medics urged him to leave the front. Any reasonable person would have accepted evacuation. Rivers refused. Instead, he climbed into another tank and returned to battle. For days, he continued leading, despite injuries that should have placed him in a hospital bed. Then, on November 19, 1944, while intentionally drawing enemy fire toward his own position to protect other tanks in his unit, Rivers was killed in action. His commanding officer immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. What happened next remains one of the most troubling chapters of the story. Reuben Rivers had earned the nation's highest military decoration, but he never received it. The recommendation disappeared within the system, and Rivers was not alone. During World War II, more than 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Yet not a single black service member received the Medal of Honor during the war itself. Not one. When the fighting ended in 1945, the men of the 761st returned home. Many came back to communities that remained segregated. Some returned to places where they still faced restrictions on voting, public accommodations, and basic civil rights. Despite their sacrifices, recognition came slowly, very slowly. In 1978, more than 3 decades after the war ended, the battalion finally received the Presidential Unit Citation for its combat performance. Even then, the full story had not yet been told. Nearly 20 years later, in 1997, the U.S. government completed a review of wartime awards involving African American soldiers. The findings revealed that racial discrimination had affected recognition during the war. As a result, 7 black World War II veterans were awarded the Medal of Honor. One of them was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. Because he had long since passed away, his family accepted the medal on his behalf. It arrived more than 50 years late. But at last, the historical record reflected the truth. The men who doubted the 761st Tank Battalion had been proven wrong, completely. Historically, the battalion that many leaders overlooked fought with extraordinary determination, endured months of relentless combat, and played a significant role in the Allied advance into Germany. They earned their place in history through action, sacrifice, and courage. This story does not attempt to portray Patton as a perfect man. He wasn't. History is more complicated than that. But when he needed soldiers, he chose to trust a battalion others had ignored. He gave them an opportunity. And the men of the 761st spent the next 183 days proving that trust was justified. Today, Patton is often remembered for his bold personality, dramatic speeches, and battlefield leadership. Yet one of the most important decisions he made may have been recognizing the value of a unit that much of the Army had underestimated. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion lived by a simple motto, "Come out fighting." And they did exactly that. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a vital part of the history of World War II. If stories like this matter to you, leave one word in the comments, remembered. Because history only stays alive when people continue telling it.